Hello. Recently, I read and enjoyed Karen Joy Fowler's recent novel, Booth. What? I don't know why I said it like that. Booth. Booth, which focuses on one of America's most notorious villains, John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated President Lincoln, and it tells his story from the point of view of a number of his siblings. And this got me discussing with friends and other readers about some of our other favorite historical fiction. So I thought I'd make a video recommending some of my favorite historical novels from recent years, and I would love to know about some of your favorite historical fiction in the comments below. I'd love to get some more suggestions. So this is a genre I really enjoy, though some readers have raised some reservations recently about it and will question like why make up stories about the past when you can read actual historical accounts. And I kind of understand that, especially in this social media age when it can be so difficult to know what the actual truth is. But I think there's a number of reasons why historical fiction is great, because it's a way of emotionally entering into the past and this history, rather than just reading a straightforward nonfiction account of it. And honestly, I find a lot of nonfiction like quite dry. If it's not written in a very creative way, I just find it difficult to engage with it. So yeah, this way of entering into the past, and by doing that, like learning about it. I mean, I've read so much historical fiction, which I've then gone and done some research and found out facts and details about events and figures from the past that I didn't really know that much about before. So yeah, it's a way of entering into that history, but also there are so many voices of people from the past that whose accounts weren't written into the history books, or who were actively silenced, and we can't know their stories. So it's a way of reimagining these figures from the past who we know must have been there, but we just don't have any of their stories because they weren't recounted, they weren't chosen to be recorded in history. So I think it's a great thing for that. So I have 9 books that I want to recommend, in addition to Booth, which I would recommend reading as well. So I'm going to discuss these different novels now. So first off, there is the Luminaries by Eleanor Caton, which is this amazing, sprawling historical novels about mid-1800s in New Zealand, in a gold mining town, following a number of characters over a period of time and the very dramatic events that occur between these characters. There's so much great historical detail about this that's really tantalizing, but the story is also so thrilling. It involves deceit and greed and murder and swapped identities and people that reinvent themselves, and their wacky seances, and there's prostitution, and there's opium. There are so many scandalous things that occur in this novel, but also really sympathetic characters which just draw you into the past and this period of time from history. And it's really exciting that Eleanor Caton has a new novel coming out next year. I can't wait to read that. She's also still the youngest individual ever to have won the Booker Prize. She was only 28 years old when she won it. Now, of course, on the current long list, there's Layla Motley, who's only 20 years old. So time will tell if she wins this year's prize. But yeah, Eleanor Caton still has that distinction. The Lonely Sea and Sky by Dermot Bolger, and this novel is set in Ireland during World War II. And yes, it can feel like there's a lot of fiction that focuses on World War II, but this gives quite a unique perspective, I think, because Ireland during the war was a neutral country, and so it tells the story of a number of sailors who see that a German ship is going down and a number of German sailors were going to drown, and they make the humanitarian decision to save their lives. But of course this has a lot of political implications, so the question of whether they should save them or not really isn't an easy one, and it focuses in particular on one sailor's life whose father died, whose father was also a sailor and died, and it's really moving how it tells his story, but yeah, also recounts this fascinating different perspective on World War II from what we've got in the past. Then there is one of my favorite novels that I read last year, Palmares by Gayl Jones, and I haven't seen too many people discussing this book, but it is such a fantastic read. It is set in 17th century Brazil and follows the story of an African girl who escapes slavery, runs towards a so-called utopian community, but then when she gets there finds out it's a very different setup from what she expected, and it follows her very dramatic life. There's also a character in this, her grandmother, who is so fascinating and endearing, and I love a good grandmother character in a novel, but there's also lots of violent and terrible things that occur in this book. It doesn't shy from the horror of history, and again I feel like we've had lots of tales about slavery in America, but not so much in South America, where there was also a huge slave trade, and so this tells one such story. Days Without End by Sebastian Barry, and I love this novel so much. It tells the story of a man who escapes the famine in Ireland to move to America, where he becomes a soldier and gets involved in the American Civil War, but also against battles against Native Americans, and so tells his story, how he's kind of drawn into fighting for causes which he doesn't necessarily believe in, but also his strong connection and love for another soldier, and the story of their romance over time, and the difficulty of that obviously during the war, and the strategies that they take to survive during this period. It just gives such a different perspective on the Civil War from anything I've read before. The Revolution of the Moon by Andrea Camilleri, who's an author that's primarily known for his mystery novels and detective fiction, but he also wrote some great historical novels. He died a few years ago, and this tale recounts the story of Donna Eleonora, who's a real-life historical figure that became viceroy of Sicily in the 1600s, but only for a brief amount of time. She kind of ascended to power, but then really struggled because she tried to implement some progressive changes in the country, which was met with a lot of resistance, and obviously being a woman in power, that was threatening to a lot of men at the time. So it tells her story using a really interesting perspective and narrative voice, and how it focuses on that and recounts her tale. It is so dramatic and interesting, and really biting look at this historical period and a fascinating time that I didn't know about before. The Illumination of Ursula Flight by Anna Marie Crowhurst, with this beautiful cover to it, which tells the story of a woman that narrates her life from her birth in 1664 and follows her progress as she's betrothed to a wealthy man, but then that doesn't really work out, and that feels like a story which has been told in a lot of historical fiction, but the point of view and the perspective that the author gives in this novel is so unique and engaging and fun. How it follows her development as a writer. She really wants to be a playwright, but then as a woman finds it difficult to find her place in English society and the theatrical world, and how she gets involved in an affair, and following that story, as well as her professional development. And it is so creative and witty and wicked and fun that I just enjoyed this so much. Now, I feel like I can't talk about favorite recent historical fiction without mentioning Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, which really it's the whole series of all three of these books, which is such an amazing involving journey following Thomas Cromwell through his life and his ascendancy to become one of the most powerful men in England, working alongside Henry VIII, but the real danger of that and precariousness of that position against such a difficult ruler. So yeah, following that story, and it did take me some time to get into these novels, but once I was in, I was so into these stories, because one of the difficulties with historical fiction obviously is there can be so much about history which you might not be familiar with, and which can feel a bit alienating because you don't understand the events which are going on. And I definitely felt that first going into this, but then did a bit of reading around it and then just went into it and decided to just go with it and see where it goes. It has one of the most beautiful and emotional openings to a novel I think I've ever read in Wolf Hall, but really the entire series is so dramatic and involving, and really brings history to life in a revolutionarily new way. Revolutionary? Well, I don't know. Revolutionary new way. Cathedral by Ben Hopkins. Now, living in London, over the years, I've gone on holiday to a number of capitals in Europe, and in a lot of these places have visited some big cathedrals there, and which feels like an awe-inspiring but also slightly tedious thing to do. I remember being in one big church in Portugal, and there was an Irishman that was like passing by me while going through this cathedral, and he said to his friend, like, I don't want to look at these other fucking churches. That's a really bad Irish accent, but yeah, I sort of get that feeling sometimes, and visiting these places, I think it's difficult to remember just how long it took to construct some of these big structures. And so this novel recounts the story of the gradual construction of a cathedral in a fictional German town in the 1200s and 1300s, and yes, even after a century this cathedral isn't completed, and it follows a number of different characters at different levels of society and who have some slight involvement with the construction of this cathedral, and it is so dramatic and fascinating. I mean, these characters are so well written, and some of them are the kinds of characters that haven't been written about in history books. There are some members of nobility, but then there are also more peasants that and it shows how the transition in this society between different kinds of economies and different forms of government, how this was like a real dramatic time of change in Europe, and it recounts that and recreates that in such a fascinating way that I just found it so compelling and moving, and was completely involved in this story, and there's lots of thrilling things that occur as well. And finally, I want to recommend probably one of my favorite novels of all time, which is Half a Yellow Sun by Chimimanda Ngozi Adichie, and this novel is about more recent times, about the civil war in Nigeria in the late 1960s, known as the Biafran War, and it tells the story of this war through the perspective of different characters over a period of time, going between their perspectives, and it is so emotional and involving and smart how she structures this and tells this tale, which gives an indication of the larger events and deaths which were occurring in the country, but it's also just such a well-written and good tale. So this is an absolutely brilliant book, one of the greatest winners of the Women's Prize for Fiction, and I think it was voted in one year as the best novel that had been won that prize in the history of the prize. So yeah, these are all books that I'd really highly recommend. I'd love to know if you've also read them, and if you like them as well, but also I'd love to hear about some of your favorite historical fiction. So yeah, please let me know about that in the comments below, and we can continue having more discussions about this really great genre. So yeah, I hope you're reading good things, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye bye.